The medieval arming sword didn't really disappear in the Renaissance. Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. So what I've got here is one of the prototypes from the upcoming Batch 2 windlass Royal Armouries line, which there will be more news coming about really soon, hopefully. Now this is an arming sword, okay? This is an arming sword, very close replica of one in the Royal Armouries. It's an amazing sword, probably has an English church provenance, probably came from a church in England, probably dates to the end of the 15th century, possibly even the early 16th century. And that's why I've picked it to talk about here. So this particular sword is, to all intents and purposes, what most of you will imagine a medieval arming sword looks like. And yes, indeed, that's true. It doesn't look really superficially very different to swords that were carried all the way back in the Crusades. It doesn't look that different to swords that were even carried at the Battle of Hastings in 1066. This particular sword, however, has some design features which help date it. It has a wheel pommel, which have been around for a couple of few centuries at this point, but it has these long dropped down curved quillons with little knobs on the end, and this particular format, coupled with what's known as an oak-shot Type 18 blade, is a particularly 15th century style of arming sword. So the arming sword, the one-handed knightly medieval sword, had been around for a few hundred years by this point. 400, 500 years, okay? It'd been around for a long time. A very successful design, and when most of you see a sword like this, you will think of probably medieval knights, medieval archers, billmen, crossbowmen, things like this. However, this type of sword did not disappear when we get into the Renaissance. Now, when did the Renaissance start? So this is somewhat open to interpretation. The Renaissance, the rebirth, it stands for the rebirth of classical learning and art, is something that really comes about in Italy in the 14th century. However, most people, I think, when you say Renaissance, think about the 16th century. If you're not aware, the 16th century means the 1500s, so 1501 onwards. So this type of sword was still prevalent, still around, still incredibly common, incredibly popular, used by all kinds of people, including knights, men-at-arms, archers, and so on and so forth, in the early 1500s. This type of sword was still around, despite the fact that new types of sword were starting to appear, starting to become popular and develop, that had come from the arming sword. Now, most people, of course, at this point, especially given recent videos I've done, will be thinking about the rapier, but we're not quite ready to come to the rapier. Let's go back a bit. What kind of fills the gap between the arming sword and the rapier? It is what is commonly referred to as a side sword. Now, side sword, as I always mention in all these videos on this topic, is a modern term, but fundamentally it's a useful term because it describes a thing that, to all intents and purposes, is a medieval arming sword with a few additions to the hilt. Those primarily usually being finger rings, because the finger was so often put over the guard by this date in order to facilitate better control and use of the point for thrusting. And in addition, various forms of either side rings, this has just got one here, sometimes you get one here, and sometimes what's called a knuckle bow, which is something, well, we'll look at the later sword when we get to it. So, but the fundamental message here is, although some people would refer to this as a side sword, it is functionally really not very different to a medieval arming sword. It is really just a medieval arming sword with the addition of some other bits of hand protection. Now, some people might say, but Matt, the side sword, according to things I've read on the internet or in a book or somewhere like that, the side sword is also more thrust centric and is going towards becoming a rapier. BS! That's not the case. That's just not true. It might be that a certain given arming sword might be more specialised to thrusting. You can find 15th century arming swords which are highly specialised to thrusting with long pointy blades, going all the way back into the 14th century. Some of them are like a pointy bar and are not suited to cutting at all. And this type of sword indeed sometimes was coupled with a more thrusty blade. In this example I'm holding here, you could say, well, it's a fairly narrow blade, isn't it? It's fairly long and it's going to be very good at thrusting, good reach, nice and nimble at the point, and it's not going to be the most powerful cutter in the world. So this is perhaps one step towards what people perceive to be a rapier. Problematic term, as I always say. What is a rapier? We don't really know how to define it exactly. So a side sword doesn't need to have a blade like this. A side sword could have exactly the same blade as an arming sword. In fact, we could take this arming sword here, stick a couple of finger rings on it. Is that magically now a side sword? Is it a different sword? Do we really use it differently? I mean, I can put my finger over this. I can use this sword in exactly the same way just because it's got some finger rings, or maybe it has a knuckle bow, or maybe it has a side ring. Does it become a whole different category of sword? I don't know. I can see the usefulness of different categorizations to describe, to communicate what we're talking about, but really, is it different? I would say no. Overall, the side sword and the arming sword are the same thing. It's just that this type has a bit more hand protection. This, of an earlier design, fundamentally has less hand protection. But if we follow the standard linear sense of evolutionary development that I think a lot of people like to imagine, the arming sword becomes the side sword, and the side sword evolves with more hand protection, a more and more specialized blade, into becoming what we call a rapier. Or does it? Fundamentally, no. Okay, so this particular rapier has a very long, narrow blade and has a certain type of swept hilt, as it's called. But the thing is, you can find this type of swept hilt on all kinds of blades. You can find swept hilts on broadsword blades, on cut and thrust blades, and indeed on dedicated thrusting blades like this. So fundamentally, is this a different sword? Well, certainly it's not a different sword because of the hilt. We can only really say that this is an especially specialized thrusting sword because the blade has got thinner and longer for greater reach, and also the point of balance and the way that the sword moves is far more catered towards control of the point than of giving cuts. So you might be saying, so in that sense, can we define the rapier by its hilt? No. Can we define it by its blade? Possibly yes. Now we get into a whole problematic next category of sword, and this is the one that I really want to demonstrate to you is the reason why we can't really say that the arming sword ever disappeared. So what we have here is a type of sword which is a group of swords. This is the LK Chen version, and this is a group of swords which have been associated with Munich Town Guard. So you will see various companies making versions of this sword, sometimes called the Town Guard sword, sometimes the Munich sword, sometimes the Munich Town Guard sword. Fundamentally, these date to about the year 1600. This is quite late. This is later, really, than this style of rapier. Okay, this is later than this style of side sword. The rapier's really been around by this point by about 40 years. So what we commonly refer to as rapiers with long narrow blades and a form of swept hilt at least, and later on cup hilts, shell hilts and Pappenheimers and things like that. The early forms of rapier really start to appear, you could say, about 1560-ish, okay? And they gradually evolve into a few different types of rapier, which we're now very familiar with. And because a lot of people look in books, and a lot of books show pictures of a sword this much, they don't show the whole blade, a lot of people look at a hilt like this and go, ah, that is a swept hilt rapier. So many times I've seen these Munich Town Guard swords referred to as rapiers. Are they rapiers? I would argue categorically not. They are not rapiers. Why would I say they're not rapiers? Well, because I define rapier by the blade form. Okay, these hilts, these swept hilts, and this is a swept hilt, can be coupled with any type of blade. If I put this hilt on a falchion, would that make the falchion a rapier? If I put this hilt on a saber blade, would that make it a rapier? No, it would still be a saber, it would still be a falchion, it just would have a swept hilt on it. You can put a hilt on any tang. So fundamentally, what are these swords? Well, let's have a look at them. Now, just before I unsheath my weapon, I should mention that this is the LK Chen version. Okay, so this is the LK Chen version of the Munich Town Guard sword. Up here on my wall, I have the windlass version of the same model of sword. Now, the first thing to say is there are a few hundred of these surviving. If I remember correctly, it's about 300 known examples surviving in different collections. There are some in America, there are some in Britain, there are some in Italy, there are some in France. They're all over the place, and they are not all the same. They are part of a family and they are similar to each other, but they are not all the same. They don't all have the same size pommel, they don't even have the exact same shape pommel, and their guards all vary a bit and their blades all vary a bit. Some are a little bit longer, some are a bit broader, they all vary. But this one here, let's have a look at this. So have a look at that blade. It's a good one, it's a nice one, and there will be a proper review coming up of this LK Chen sword really soon. But you have a look at the outline of that blade, okay? Now, I will pick up the 15th century style arming sword that I was holding earlier and hold it next to it. Wow, that's pretty similar. Yeah, really, really similar. So this fundamentally, although it's a swept hilt, it's not a rapier. This is an arming sword. It has what you at Oakshop would have called a Type 18 blade on it. So in a nutshell, what is this? What do we call it? Is it an arming sword? I don't know. If I say arming sword, remember language is about communication, people think of a medieval knightly sword like this. But these were around throughout the 16th century as well. And it is important to note, although this dates to about 1600 and this dates to about 1500, simple hilted arming swords were still around, certainly in the middle of the 1500s. So these were still around for a long, long time. And as ceremonial swords, they're around until the modern day, basically. So is this an arming sword? Well, there's a problem of communication there, because you say arming sword, people think of that medieval sword. Is this a rapier? I would say categorically not, because it's got completely the wrong kind of blade on it. So the form and function of this do not comply with what most people think of as a rapier, although, as I've mentioned in a recent video, the term rapier is also problematic. And if we look at Joachim Meyer's treatise, he talks about a rapier in German, and he shows something that we would call a side sword. It doesn't really look like what we call a rapier at all. Can we therefore call this, because this is a cut and thrust blade on a complex hilt, could we call it a side sword? Well, I have to agree that for most internet communications, so posting on Facebook or Twitter or Reddit or wherever, if you refer to this as a side sword, probably nobody is going to argue with you and nobody's going to pick you up on it. Because in the modern world, a side sword is accepted to be a complex hilted cut and thrust sword. So unofficially, most people think of a side sword essentially as a later 16th century, even though they started in the 15th century incidentally, but as a later 16th century evolution of the knightly arming sword. However, there are two main problems with the word side sword. Firstly, it doesn't describe a type of blade, okay? You can say side sword and you might be referring to something more like a rapier, or you could say side sword and you might literally be referring to a medieval arming sword. And this type of side sword here first appears in about the 1460s, so well into the 15th century. The second reason is it doesn't describe any particular type of hilt, it just describes a basic concept. Also, this type of hilt can be found on rapiers or what people might call side swords. And finally, let's look at the blade of this thing. There is no denying that the blade here is extremely similar to the blade here. Okay, so this one happens to be a bit more pointy, but we can pick up another 15th century arming sword and it will have almost exactly the identical blade to this. So in terms of how you use this sword, okay, yes, it's got more hand protection, so you're going to spend more time with the sword extended in front of yourself than you necessarily would do with a medieval arming sword, because you've got the hand protection there to allow you to do that. But in terms of actually hitting the target with cuts and thrust, there's no difference between this blade. Moreover, the other thing to mention is a lot of times you would have got 15th century arming sword blades remounted with later hilts. So literally the blade would be from a medieval arming sword. So where do we land? I don't know. What do we call these? Do you know what? What the period sources call them is sword. If we look in German sources, this would usually be referred to as a Schwert. If we look in Italian sources, spada. In Spanish, espada. It's really, in English sources, sword. And we literally get, in English sources, we get short sword, long sword, rapier, and sometimes tuck. So clearly they were making differentiations. For the most part, in English sources, if we look at Swetnam and Silver and people like this, then, so we're talking sort of around the year 1600, generally speaking, a short sword is referring to a form of backsword. A long sword is probably referring to, as I've mentioned in a previous video, something like this other LK Chen rapier, which has actually got quite a broad blade on it, but it is nevertheless a long blade. So probably that's a long sword. And then what they refer to as a rapier is probably a particularly narrow blade that can cut but is not going to deal out big cleaving blows like that previous one. It is a more specialised thruster. And then probably what they refer to as a tuck, from the word estuck, or various other related words in other languages. There's Italian and Spanish versions. Probably just means a thrusting blade where it doesn't have any cutting capacity at all. It's a square blade, so on and so forth. But fundamentally, these swords, which are around in the year 1600 and beyond that, up until really the 1620s, 30s, even 1640s, these are cut and thrust blades that fundamentally are arming swords. They are swords just like medieval arming swords here. So we can say, really, in a sense, the arming sword never went away, it never disappeared, it just evolved and generally got more hand protection, although these simple hilted ones, particularly for use in armour, did stay around even quite late in the 16th century as well. I hope that's useful and thought-provoking. Your views are always valued below in the comments. I hope I'll see you down there and chat with a few of you. Please give this video a like, share it around, make sure you're subscribed. I have been Matt Easton and I will continue to be. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.